4 giants, 1 bloodline, multiple battles that most Christians have never heard about. While everyone knows about David and Goliath, almost nobody realizes that this was just the first encounter in a multi-generational war against an entire family of supernatural warriors. The Bible records at least 4 separate giants from this forgotten bloodline, each one standing over 9 feet tall, each one wielding weapons that would make Goliath's spear look like a toothpick. But here's what will blow your mind. The final giant wasn't defeated until decades after Goliath fell, and the story of how it happened will change everything you thought you knew about these ancient battles. So before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely like what I do here. As always, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Please introduce yourself, let us know where you're watching from, and what time it is. It really makes us feel like the global community it really is. Thank you for joining me today. So let's dive in. More than one giant introducing the Gittite dynasty. When you hear the name Goliath, a single image forms in your mind. A towering warrior, bronze armor gleaming in the valley of Elah, a champion standing alone against an army. But Goliath was never alone. He belonged to a lineage, a feared warrior clan that terrorized the lands of Canaan for generations. The city of Gath bred these warriors. Ancient texts describe it as one of 5 great Philistine cities positioned inland from the coastal plains. Archaeological evidence from Tel Es-Safi, the site identified with ancient Gath, reveals fortifications of unusual scale. The walls stood thick and imposing. This was no ordinary settlement. Goliath came from this place. More than that, he represented the pinnacle of a bloodline that stretched back through the conquest narratives, through the days when the Israelites first glimpsed the Promised Land. The Hebrew scriptures call them the Anakim. Later texts use another name, the Rephaim. These were not mythical creatures from folklore. They were real people, described in historical accounts as warriors of exceptional height and strength. The biblical record preserves their presence across multiple books. Deuteronomy speaks of them. Joshua chronicles their territories. Samuel and Chronicles document their final encounters with the armies of David. Yet, somewhere between Sunday school lessons and popular culture, the story contracted. Goliath became an isolated figure, a lone giant facing a shepherd boy. The rest of his family disappeared from memory. This narrowing of focus happened gradually. Early Jewish commentators knew the broader story. The Talmud references the giants of Gath. Medieval scholars discussed them. But as the David and Goliath narrative became distilled into a simple tale of faith versus pride, the context faded. The other giants became footnotes, then vanished entirely from common knowledge. The biblical texts never forgot them. 2 Samuel chapter 21 preserves 4 distinct accounts of battles against warriors from Gath. Each one is described with the same Hebrew phrase, descendants of the Rapha in Gath. The terminology is specific. These were not random tall soldiers. They belonged to a particular lineage, a family line that traced back through generations. Understanding this changes everything about the Goliath story. David did not simply defeat an intimidating enemy. He struck at the heart of a dynastic threat, a warrior aristocracy that had menaced the region for centuries. His victory at Elah was the beginning, not the end. The conflict would continue through his reign, involving his nephews and his mightiest warriors. 4 more giants would fall before the bloodline finally ended. The ancient Near Eastern context helps explain why these warriors held such significance. In that world, physical prowess connected directly to political power. Kings and champions demonstrated their legitimacy through combat. The Philistines, who had migrated to Canaan's coastal regions around 1200 BCE, according to archaeological consensus, brought with them military traditions from the Aegean world. They valued individual combat skill. They celebrated warrior elites. Gath became the center of this giant warrior culture. The city's strategic position gave it control over the Shephelah, the transitional zone between the coastal plain and the central hill country where the Israelite tribes settled. Whoever held Gath could threaten both regions. The presence of these exceptional warriors made that threat credible for generations. The Hebrew texts describe these warriors with precise details. Their weapons receive careful attention. Their armor is measured and cataloged. Their physical characteristics are noted. This is not the language of legend or exaggeration. It reads like intelligence reports, like the accounts of soldiers who faced these enemies and lived to describe them. More importantly, the texts place these warriors within a theological framework. They represent something beyond military threat. They embody opposition to the divine plan for the land of Canaan. When the Israelite spies first entered the land and reported back about the inhabitants, the Anakim inspired such terror that an entire generation lost faith. That failure set the trajectory for 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. The giants became a test. They represented the gap between divine promise and human courage. Joshua's generation finally entered the land, but even then, pockets of Anakim remained. The text specifically mentioned 3 cities where they survived: Gath, Gaza, and Ashdod. All 3 were Philistine strongholds. The warrior culture of these giants merged with Philistine military tradition, creating a formidable hybrid. Goliath emerged from this synthesis. He wore Greek-style armor. He fought with Mediterranean weapons. But his bloodline traced back to the pre-Israelite inhabitants of Canaan, to the tall warriors who had nearly prevented the conquest entirely. When he stepped into the valley of Elah, he carried the weight of that history. He represented unfinished business from Joshua's time. Behind him stood his brothers. 4 of them are named in the biblical record. Others likely existed but went unrecorded. Together, they formed the last generation of a dying breed. The Anakim had been pushed back, reduced to small enclaves in Philistine territory. These final warriors were the remnant, the survivors of centuries of conflict. Their story intersects with David's rise to power. As he transformed from shepherd to king, as he built his army and established his kingdom, these giants stood as obstacles. They were not coincidental enemies. They were systematic opposition, the old guard resisting the new order. Each encounter with them marked a milestone in David's consolidation of power over the land. The biblical authors understood this significance. They structured their accounts to show progression. First, young David defeats Goliath. Later, an aging King David nearly falls to another giant and must be rescued. Finally, David's warriors systematically eliminate the remaining brothers. The arc shows both the passage of time and the completion of an ancient campaign. This is more than a collection of battle stories. It represents the end of an era. The giants of Canaan, who had inspired terror since the days of Moses, who had nearly derailed the entire conquest, who had survived in their Philistine refuges for generations, finally met their end. The land that had been promised to Abraham could finally rest without these ancient adversaries. The following parts of this account will examine each thread of this tapestry. We will revisit the famous encounter in the Valley of Elah with new eyes. We will trace the giant lineages back through the conquest narratives. We will meet each of Goliath's brothers individually, learning their names, their weapons, their fates. We will solve textual mysteries that have puzzled readers for centuries, and we will understand why this forgotten dynasty matters to the larger biblical story. The first giant, Goliath of Gath, in 1 Samuel 17. The morning sun barely broke the horizon when the Philistine champion emerged from the camp. 1 Samuel chapter 17 preserves the moment in vivid detail. The army of Saul had gathered in the valley of Elah, positioned on one ridge. The Philistines occupied the opposite slope. Between them stretched the valley floor, neutral ground where champions could meet. Goliath of Gath measured 6 cubits and a span according to the Masoretic text. That translates to roughly 9 feet 6 inches. Some ancient manuscripts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, give a smaller figure, 4 cubits and a span, closer to 6 feet 9 inches. Scholars debate which represents the original reading. What remains undisputed is that this warrior stood taller than his contemporaries, tall enough to be noteworthy, tall enough to inspire fear. His armor tells us much about Philistine military culture. The bronze helmet followed Mediterranean designs. His coat of mail weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze, approximately 125 pounds. Bronze greaves protected his legs. Between his shoulders, he carried a bronze javelin. The spear shaft was compared to a weaver's beam, a detail that would echo through later accounts of his relatives. The iron spearhead alone weighed 600 shekels, about 15 pounds. This equipment marked him as part of an elite class. Bronze working required technical skill and resources. Iron was even more valuable in that period, around 1050 to 1000 BCE, based on the reign of Saul. The Philistines controlled iron production in the region according to 1 Samuel chapter 13. Israelite farmers had to travel to Philistine territories just to sharpen their tools. This monopoly on metal technology gave the Philistines military advantage. Goliath's armor-bearer walked before him. This detail matters. The presence of an attendant signaled aristocratic status. Common soldiers carried their own equipment. Champions, men of rank and reputation, had servants. The armor-bearer would have carried the large shield, the cinna, which protected the champion's entire body. This freed Goliath to focus on his weapons and intimidation tactics. For 40 days, morning and evening, he issued his challenge. The pattern is significant. Twice daily, with rhythmic regularity, he called for single combat. This was not impulsive bravado. It was psychological warfare, a calculated strategy to demoralize the Israelite forces. Each day without a response reinforced Philistine dominance. Each morning, Saul's reputation as king diminished. The challenge itself followed ancient Near Eastern conventions for champion warfare. Archaeological evidence and texts from surrounding cultures document this practice. When armies reached stalemate, when neither side wanted to risk full battle, champions could decide the outcome. The winner's army would claim victory. The loser's force would submit. This reduced casualties while still resolving conflicts. Goliath's words dripped with contempt. He called the Israelite ranks servants of Saul, reducing them to mere attendants of their king. He offered terms. Send one man, let him fight, winner takes all. The stakes were enslavement. The losing side would become subjects of the victors. For the Israelites, this threat carried extra weight. They had only recently established their monarchy, trying to unite scattered tribes into a nation. Subjugation to the Philistines would end that project before it truly began. Saul and his army were terrified. The Hebrew word used is chathath, which implies being shattered or dismantled emotionally. This was not simple fear. It was crushing demoralization. The greatest warriors in Saul's army, men who had fought in previous campaigns, refused the challenge. Day after day, no one stepped forward. Enter David. The youngest son of Jesse, not yet part of the standing army, he arrived bringing supplies for his brothers. He heard the challenge. More importantly, he heard the insult embedded in it. Goliath was not just threatening the army, he was defying the armies of the living God. That phrase appears repeatedly in David's responses. For him, this was not primarily a military matter. It was theological. The contrast between the two warriors could not be starker. Goliath wore massive bronze armor. David refused Saul's equipment, choosing instead his staff, his sling, and 5 smooth stones from the stream bed. Goliath had professional training from youth. David had wilderness experience guarding sheep. Goliath represented an ancient warrior lineage. David was an untested shepherd. Yet David understood something Goliath did not. The Philistine champion approached combat as a contest of physical prowess. He relied on his size, his armor, his weapons. These were formidable advantages in hand-to-hand fighting, but David had no intention of fighting hand-to-hand. The sling was a ranged weapon, capable of launching projectiles at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour according to modern ballistics analysis. In skilled hands, it was lethal at significant distance. Goliath's response to David reveals his mindset. He cursed him by his gods. He mocked the staff, asking if David thought him a dog. He promised to feed David's flesh to the birds and beasts. These were standard intimidation tactics, meant to break an opponent's nerve before physical combat began. They worked on most adversaries. David's reply shifted the framework entirely. He declared he came in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of the Israelites, whom Goliath had defied. He predicted that the Philistine would fall that day. He stated that the battle belonged to God, not to human strength. He announced that everyone assembled would learn that the Lord does not save by sword and spear. The actual combat lasted seconds. Goliath advanced. David ran toward him, reaching into his bag for a stone. The sling whirled. The stone flew. It struck Goliath in the forehead, the one vulnerable spot on a warrior wearing a helmet. The giant fell face down to the ground. The physics explain the outcome. A stone from a sling launched by an experienced user generates tremendous force. The forehead provides a large target but minimal protection. Even a glancing blow can cause concussion. A direct hit at that velocity could fracture the skull, causing immediate incapacitation or death. David's stone found its mark perfectly. What followed sealed the victory. David ran forward, took Goliath's own sword since he had none of his own, and used it to sever the giant's head. This brutal act served multiple purposes. It ensured Goliath was truly gone. It provided proof of victory. It demoralized the Philistine army, who broke and fled when they saw their champion fall. The theological significance outweighs even the military implications. This moment demonstrated that the God of the Israelites acted on behalf of his people. The intimidating giant who had paralyzed Saul's army for 40 days fell to a shepherd boy. The message was clear: trust in God produces victory where human strength fails. But this was not the end of the giant threat. It was merely the most famous chapter. Goliath's death removed one warrior from the battlefield. His family remained. His brothers, trained in the same warrior culture, shaped by the same lineage, still lived in Gath. They would carry forward his legacy. They would seek to avenge his death. And they would ensure that David's conflict with the giants of Gath continued for decades to come. The account in 1 Samuel presents Goliath as an individual, but ancient readers understood him as a representative. He stood for a whole category of enemy, a whole history of conflict. His defeat was significant precisely because it opened the door to addressing the larger giant problem. Joshua had pushed them back but not eliminated them. Now, generations later, the work would continue. The forgotten verses, the giants in the conquest narrative. Long before David faced Goliath, before the Philistines occupied the coastal cities, before the Israelite tribes had even entered the Promised Land, the giants were already there. The conquest narratives in Deuteronomy and Joshua introduce them, not as mythical beings, but as a geopolitical reality that shaped Israelite history. The story begins in Numbers chapter 13. Moses sent 12 spies to scout the land of Canaan. They traveled for 40 days, observing the territory from the wilderness of Zin to Rehob. When they returned, 10 of the 12 brought a report that changed everything. Yes, the land flowed with milk and honey. Yes, the fruit was abundant, but the people living there were powerful and the cities were fortified and very large. Then came the critical detail. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This comparison to grasshoppers reveals the psychological impact. The spies were not simply noting that the inhabitants were tall. They felt reduced, diminished, unable to conceive of victory. The name Anak appears here for the first time in the biblical record. The Anakim, as his descendants came to be called, inhabited the hill country. 3 specific names are mentioned: Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai. Later texts identify their stronghold as Hebron, one of the most ancient cities in Canaan. Archaeological excavations at Tel Rumeida, the site of ancient Hebron, show continuous occupation dating back to the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BCE. The majority report from the spies triggered a crisis of faith. The entire congregation of the Israelites wept that night. They complained against Moses and Aaron. They proposed returning to the bondage in the land along the Nile rather than face the Anakim. Only 2 voices dissented. Joshua and Caleb insisted the land could be taken, that the Lord would deliver the inhabitants into their hands. The people refused to listen. They threatened to stone Joshua and Caleb. At that moment, according to Numbers 14, the glory of the Lord appeared. Divine judgment followed. The generation that had witnessed the Exodus would not enter the land. They would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies had explored. Only Joshua and Caleb would survive to see the promise fulfilled. This decision created a generational gap in Israelite history. The fear of the Anakim caused 40 years of delay. The giants became more than military obstacles. They represented the test that the first generation failed. When Moses later recounted this story in Deuteronomy, he emphasized the consequences. The giants had power beyond their physical size. They had the power to paralyze faith. Deuteronomy chapter 1 through 3 provides additional context about the giant populations. Moses described other groups related to the Anakim. The Emim lived east of the Jordan, considered Rephaim like the Anakim. The Moabites called them Emim, meaning terrifying ones. The Ammonites dealt with a similar population called them Zumim, another name for the Rephaim. These groups inhabited different territories but shared common characteristics: great height, great numbers, and great strength. The Hebrew term Rephaim appears across multiple biblical books. In some contexts, it refers to departeds or shades of the underworld. In the conquest narratives, it clearly designates a people group, a pre-Israelite population of exceptional stature. Deuteronomy 2 explains that the Moabites and Ammonites had already displaced some of these populations before the Israelites arrived. This detail grounds the narrative in historical conquest patterns rather than supernatural fantasy. Moses also mentioned King Og of Bashan, described as the last of the Rephaim. His bed, made of iron, measured 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. Whether this refers to an actual bed or perhaps a sarcophagus remains debated among scholars. What matters is the consistent pattern. These rulers and their peoples were notably tall and formidable in battle. When Joshua finally led the new generation into Canaan, the giant problem remained. Joshua chapter 11 records the campaign in the northern territories. After defeating various Canaanite coalitions, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor. More relevantly, verse 21 states, "At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction along with their cities." This sounds like complete victory. The next verse, however, adds a crucial qualification. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the Israelites. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. 3 cities. All 3 would become Philistine strongholds. The survivors found refuge in territories that would soon host the sea peoples migrating from the Aegean. The Philistine arrival changed the equation. These migrants, archaeologically attested around 1200 BCE through distinctive pottery styles and cultural markers, brought their own military traditions. When they occupied the coastal plain and established their pentapolis, 5 cities, Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Ekron, they inherited some of the remaining Anakim populations. The fusion of Philistine military organization with Anakim physical attributes created the warrior elite David would eventually face. Caleb's story provides personal dimension to the giant narrative. Joshua chapter 14 recounts how Caleb, now 85 years old, asked for the hill country where the Anakim lived. He had spied out that land 4 decades earlier. He had seen the giants. Unlike his generation, he did not fear them. Joshua blessed him and gave him Hebron as his inheritance. Joshua chapter 15 adds detail. Caleb drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, descendants of Anak. These were the same names mentioned by the spies in Numbers 13. 45 years later, Caleb finished what that generation had been too afraid to attempt. The man who maintained faith in the face of grasshopper fears claimed the giant's stronghold as his reward. Yet even Caleb's victory was not total. The Anakim survived in the Philistine cities. They regrouped, they intermarried, they passed down their warrior traditions. By the time of Saul and David, several generations had passed. The Anakim were no longer a widespread Canaanite population. They had become a specialized military caste within Philistine society, concentrated in Gath. This historical progression explains why Goliath was such a significant threat. He represented unfinished business from Joshua's conquest. The Promised Land still contained remnants of the peoples who were supposed to have been removed. Their presence in Philistine territory made them more dangerous, not less. They had access to superior weapons technology. They had structured military support. They were not scattered tribes, but integrated members of a powerful enemy nation. The theological theme running through these texts is unmistakable. The giants represent obstacles to divine promise. They test whether God's people will trust him despite intimidating circumstances. The first generation saw giants and lost faith. The second generation saw the same giants and pressed forward. Caleb saw giants and asked for the privilege of fighting them. David saw giants and declared they defied the living God. The conquest narratives establish that removing the giant populations was part of the original plan for the land. Their survival in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod meant the plan remained incomplete. Each encounter with them in later books represents a continuation of the conquest, a fulfillment delayed but not abandoned. When David defeated Goliath, he was not simply winning a battle. He was completing a task that began when the spies first glimpsed the Anakim in the hills of Hebron. The seed of the Rephaim, unpacking the ancient genealogy. The biblical texts describe the giants using multiple names: Anakim, Rephaim, Nephilim, Emim, Zamzumim. Understanding the relationship between these terms requires careful examination of ancient Hebrew usage and historical context. These were not interchangeable labels but represented different aspects of a complex pre-Israelite population. The term Rephaim appears most frequently. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, Moses explains that the Emim had lived in the region east of the Salt Sea. They were a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. This passage establishes Rephaim as the broader category, with Anakim and Emim as specific tribal designations. Further in the same chapter, Moses mentions the Zamzumim, who lived in the territory that would become Ammonite land. A people great and many and tall as the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Ammonites call them Zamzumim. The pattern repeats. Different peoples had different names for these populations, but they shared common characteristics that grouped them under the Rephaim designation. The Hebrew word Rephaim itself carries multiple meanings in biblical texts. In some passages, particularly in poetic books like Job and Psalms, it refers to the shades of the underworld, departed spirits residing in Sheol. In historical narratives, it clearly indicates a people group. Some scholars suggest the connection. Perhaps these peoples were named for their legendary ancestors, or perhaps later underworld associations developed from memories of this formidable population. Genesis chapter 14 provides early reference to the Rephaim. During the campaign of the eastern kings against the cities of the plain, the text notes they defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shava Kiriathaim. This places Rephaim populations in the Transjordan region during the patriarchal period, centuries before the Israelite conquest. Genesis chapter 15, where God makes covenant with Abraham, lists the peoples occupying the promised land. Among them, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. The Rephaim appear as one group among many pre-Israelite inhabitants. The valley of Rephaim receives mention in Joshua chapter 15 and 2 Samuel chapters 5 and 23. Located southwest of Jerusalem, this valley served as a route between the coastal plain and the hill country. The name suggests Rephaim populations once occupied or controlled this strategic location. Archaeological surveys of the valley have revealed early Bronze Age remains, confirming ancient settlement patterns. Joshua chapter 12 lists defeated kings, including the king of Ai, which is beside Bethel, and others. Verse 4 mentions Og, king of Bashan, one of the remnant of the Rephaim, who lived at Ashtaroth and at Edrei. This designation as remnant indicates the Rephaim were already declining by Joshua's time. Og represented survival, not flourishing. The Anakim connects specifically to this Rephaim heritage. Numbers chapter 13 describes them as descendants of Anak, who was himself descended from the Rephaim according to traditional interpretation. The spies who saw them in the hill country made an additional comparison. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. This brings us to the most mysterious term, Nephilim. Genesis chapter 6 introduces them in one of Scripture's most enigmatic passages. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The etymology of Nephilim remains debated. The Hebrew root nephal means to fall, leading some to translate it as fallen ones. Others suggest it derives from a different root meaning giants or mighty ones. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, renders it as gigantes, which gives us the English word giants. The connection between the pre-flood Nephilim and the post-flood Anakim is not explicit in the text. The statement, and also afterward in Genesis 6, suggests the Nephilim somehow continued beyond the flood, but the mechanism is not explained. Jewish tradition and some ancient interpreters developed elaborate theories about this survival. The biblical text itself remains ambiguous. What seems clear is that ancient Israelites viewed the Anakim and related peoples as connected to very old pre-conquest populations. Whether this connection was genealogical, cultural, or legendary, these groups carried associations with antiquity and power. They were not recent immigrants, but deeply rooted inhabitants with long histories in the land. Archaeological evidence complicates simple identification. Skeletal remains from Bronze Age Canaan show normal human height variation. No evidence exists for populations of genuinely gigantic stature. This suggests the biblical descriptions of great height should be understood relatively rather than absolutely. These were tall people compared to average Israelites, not biological impossibilities. The cubit measurements given for Goliath and Og, if taken literally, would place them well outside normal human variation. The 6 cubits and a span for Goliath equals approximately 9.5 feet. Yet the Septuagint and Dead Sea Scroll versions give 4 cubits and a span, closer to 6 feet 9 inches. This remains tall but within human possibility, especially for a warrior elite selected partially for size. The term sons of Anak appears frequently. Anak himself is identified as a son of Arba. Joshua chapter 15 states that Hebron was formerly called Kiriath Arba, the city of Arba, the greatest man among the Anakim. Whether Arba was a historical founder or a legendary ancestor remains uncertain. The text treats him as a real person connected to Hebron's origins. Deuteronomy chapter 9, where Moses reviews the conquest challenges, emphasizes the intimidation factor. Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today, to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know, and of whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak? The phrase fortified up to heaven is clearly hyperbolic, emphasizing impressiveness rather than literal measurement. Similarly, who can stand before the sons of Anak represents rhetorical exaggeration expressing the challenge these warriors posed. The biblical authors used heightened language to convey the psychological and military impact of facing such opponents. By the time David confronted Goliath, the Rephaim existed only in isolated pockets. The broad populations described in Deuteronomy had been displaced or absorbed. What remained was a specialized warrior class in Philistine Gath, carrying forward genetic and cultural heritage from the Anakim. They were literally the last of their kind, final representatives of populations that once dominated the hill country and Transjordan. This genealogical context transforms how we understand Goliath and his brothers. They were not anomalies. They were survivors, carrying forward a lineage that stretched back through the conquest, through the patriarchal period, possibly to the very dawn of settlement in Canaan. Their defeat would mark not just military victory, but the closing of a chapter that began when the first Israelites glimpsed the promised land and trembled. A family affair. The 4 giants of 2 Samuel 21. 2 Samuel chapter 21 contains one of Scripture's most overlooked passages. Buried between David's later reign accounts and the poetic sections that close the book, 4 brief battle reports describe encounters with warriors from Gath. Most readers miss them. Those who notice often fail to recognize their significance. These verses document the systematic elimination of Goliath's family. The passage begins with context about a famine. 3 years of crop failure had struck the land. David inquired of the Lord about the cause. The answer involved blood guilt from Saul's treatment of the Gibeonites, a complex situation requiring 7 of Saul's descendants to be handed over for execution. This dark episode established the time frame, late in David's reign, decades after his famous victory in the Valley of Elah. Then, abruptly, verse 15 shifts focus. There was war again between the Philistines and Israel, and David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines, and David grew weary. This detail matters. The young shepherd who ran toward Goliath had become a middle-aged king whose stamina was failing. The man who once defeated giants now struggled in ordinary combat. Verse 16 introduces the first brother. And Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants, whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, and who was armed with a new sword, thought to strike down David. The Hebrew phrase translated as descendants of the giants, is Yeled HaRapha, literally sons of the Rapha, or born of the Rapha. This designates a specific lineage, not a general category. The 300 shekels equals approximately 7.5 pounds for the spearhead, less than Goliath's 600 shekel point, but still substantial. The mention of a new sword suggests recent acquisition, perhaps specially forged for the campaign. Ishbi-Benob saw opportunity. The aging David, separated from his main force, exhausted from fighting, presented a vulnerable target, but Abishai son of Zeruiah came to David's aid. He struck down the Philistine warrior. The text notes this rescue prompted David's men to swear an oath, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." The king's life had become too valuable to risk in personal combat. This moment marked David's transition from warrior to monarch, from active combatant to protected symbol. Verse 18 shifts to another encounter. After this, there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. Gob is identified as a location, though its exact site remains uncertain. Some ancient texts give Gezer instead, a major city in the Shephelah. Either location places this battle in contested territory between Israelite hills and Philistine plains. Saph, also called Siptah in the parallel account in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, receives minimal description. Unlike Ishbi-Benob with his noted weapons, or the later brothers with distinctive features, Saph appears briefly. His defeat by Sibbecai the Hushathite matters primarily because it continues the pattern. Another descendant of the giants in Gath fell to one of David's warriors. Verse 19 introduces the most famous textual problem in this passage. And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan the son of Jare-Oregim the Bethlehemite struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. This appears to contradict 1 Samuel 17, where David struck down Goliath. Readers have puzzled over this verse for centuries. The parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 20 verse 5 solves the mystery. And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan the son of Jair struck down Lami the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Lami is specifically identified as Goliath's brother. The Samuel text apparently suffered a scribal error in transmission, omitting the word brother and corrupting Lami into part of the previous name. This textual variant demonstrates both the complexity of ancient manuscript transmission and the value of having parallel accounts. Chronicles, compiled later and drawing from multiple sources, preserve the correct reading. Elhanan did not defeat Goliath. He defeated Goliath's brother, a warrior who carried a similarly massive spear. The description, like a weaver's beam, appears for both Goliath and Lami. This phrase refers to the wooden beam used in ancient looms, typically thick and heavy. The comparison suggests spear shafts of unusual diameter, capable of bearing the weight of large iron points. It became something of a family trademark, a distinguishing feature of this warrior clan's weaponry. Verse 20 introduces the fourth and final brother, the most unusual of the group. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature, who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also was descended from the giants. Polydactyly, the presence of extra digits, occurs naturally in human populations at a rate of roughly 1 in every 1,000 births. This genetic trait appears in families inherited through dominant genes. Its presence in this warrior suggests the giant lineage maintained close family ties, perhaps even practiced intermarriage to preserve their distinctive characteristics. The text treats the extra digits not as deformity but as identifying feature, another marker of this family's unique nature. Verse 21 adds behavioral detail. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. The Hebrew word translated taunted is keraf, the same root used for Goliath's defiance in 1 Samuel 17. This brother followed family tradition, issuing challenges and insults to the Israelite forces. Perhaps he learned these tactics from Goliath himself. Perhaps the family taught such methods to each generation of warriors. Jonathan, identified as David's nephew rather than his brother in some translations, ended this final giant's life. The genealogy matters. David defeated the first brother Goliath. David's nephew Abishai rescued David from the second brother, Ishbi-Benob. David's mighty men Sibbecai and Elhanan defeated the third and fourth brothers, Saph and Lami. David's nephew Jonathan defeated the fifth brother, the one with extra digits. The campaign against this family became a multi-generational effort, involving David's extended family and closest warriors. Verse 22 provides the summary statement. These four were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. The number 4 refers specifically to the battles recorded in this passage, not counting Goliath from 1 Samuel 17. Together, 5 warriors from this bloodline met their end during David's lifetime. The Hebrew construction Yeled ha-Rapha be-Gath appears consistently, born of the Rapha in Gath. This phrase establishes both lineage and geography. These warriors shared common ancestry traced to the Rephaim. They all came from Gath specifically, not from Gaza or Ashdod, where other Anakim survivors had settled. Gath bred this particular family of warriors. The pattern of these encounters reveals strategic thinking. After Goliath's defeat, the Philistines continued fielding champions from his family. Perhaps they sought revenge. Perhaps they hoped to restore their psychological advantage. Perhaps these warriors volunteered, driven by family honor and blood ties. Whatever their motivation, they kept appearing in conflicts between the Philistines and David's forces. David's response was systematic. He could not personally face each one. Age and royal responsibilities prevented that. Instead, he built a cadre of elite warriors capable of handling such threats. The mighty men of David, documented in 2 Samuel chapter 23, included Sibbecai and others who proved themselves against giants. David created a military system that could function without his personal combat involvement. This progression shows maturity in leadership. The young David needed to prove himself through personal valor. He had to defeat Goliath to establish credibility. The experienced King David needed to develop others who could protect the kingdom. He had to empower his nephews and warriors to handle threats while he provided strategic direction. The elimination of the giant brothers became a shared achievement, not a solo performance. The geographical references also tell a story. These battles occurred at various locations. In general combat, where David grew weary, at Gob or Gezer, at Gath itself. The conflicts were not concentrated in one campaign, but spread across years. Each encounter represented a separate incident in the ongoing struggle between Philistine and Israelite territories. Gath's role as the source of all 5 warriors emphasizes that city's unique character. While other Philistine cities engaged in trade, diplomacy, and agriculture, Gath maintained a warrior culture rooted in its Anakim heritage. The fusion of Rephaim lineage with Philistine military organization created specialists in individual combat, champions who could shift the balance in close battles. The weapons described across these accounts show consistency and variation. Multiple brothers carried spears with shafts like weaver's beams. Ishbi-Benob had a 300-shekel spearhead and a new sword. The emphasis on weaponry reflects the importance of equipment in ancient warfare. These warriors were not simply tall and strong. They were well-armed professionals with access to quality bronze and iron. The fact that 4 separate biblical authors or editors considered these encounters worth preserving indicates their significance. Space in ancient texts was limited. Scribes did not record every battle or every casualty. These 5 giants merited documentation because they represented something beyond typical military engagements. They were milestones, markers of progress in fulfilling the conquest mandate. From a narrative perspective, 2 Samuel 21 provides closure. The story that began with Goliath's challenge in the valley concludes with the final brother falling at Gath. The giant bloodline that had menaced the region since Joshua's time met its end during David's reign. The king who rose to fame by defeating the most famous giant oversaw the defeat of the entire family. The emotional arc matters too. David's near-death experience with Ishbi-Benob reminded everyone of mortality. The great giant slayer had grown vulnerable. This humanizing moment makes the subsequent victories by his men more meaningful. They were not diminishing David's legacy, they were extending it, proving that his faith and courage had inspired a generation of warriors who could carry forward the work. The oath sworn by David's men after the Ishbi-Benob incident reveals deep loyalty and pragmatic wisdom. You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel. They recognized David's symbolic importance transcended his physical capabilities. The nation needed him alive more than it needed him fighting. This marks a crucial transition in Israelite military culture from tribal champions to organized armies with protected leadership. The giants of Gath served as the last connection to the pre-conquest inhabitants. Their elimination represented the final stage of possessing the land. When the last brother fell, when Gath no longer produced champions descended from the Anakim, the conquest was truly complete. The work Joshua began, which Caleb continued, which David advanced, finally reached its conclusion. The promised land was cleared of the ancient inhabitants who had once inspired such terror that an entire generation lost faith. Ishbi-Benob, the Avenger with a new sword. The battle where Ishbi-Benob nearly ended David's life receives less attention than it deserves. This encounter, recorded in 2 Samuel 21 verse 16, occurred late in David's reign. The chronology places it after the establishment of his kingdom, after his triumphs and failures, after the Bathsheba incident, after Absalom's rebellion. David was no longer young. The text states simply that David went down together with his servants, and they fought against the Philistines, and David grew weary. That word weary translates the Hebrew ayef, which indicates exhaustion, fatigue that affects combat effectiveness. In the chaos of battle, surrounded by fighting, the king's stamina failed. This physical weakness created opportunity. Ishbi-Benob was watching. His name appears only once in Scripture, in this single verse. The name structure suggests Philistine origin. The element Benob may connect to Nob, a priestly city, though the linguistic connection remains speculative. What matters is that he belonged to the giant lineage. The text identifies him as one of the descendants of the giants, using the specific phrase, Yeled Harafa. His spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze. This measurement equals roughly 7.5 pounds for the spearhead alone. Heavier than typical infantry spears, lighter than Goliath's massive 600 shekel point. The weight suggests a weapon balanced between throwing capability and thrusting power. A skilled warrior could hurl such a spear with deadly force or use it in close combat. The mention of his new sword adds intriguing detail. The Hebrew word kadash means fresh, recently made, unused. Why specify this? Perhaps the newness indicated special forging, a blade crafted specifically for this campaign. Perhaps it suggested ceremonial significance, a weapon blessed or dedicated for a particular purpose. Perhaps it simply meant Ishbi-Benob had recently equipped himself with the finest available weapon. Swords in this period were valuable. Iron working technology was still relatively new to the region. The Philistines controlled much of the iron production according to 1 Samuel 13. A new iron sword represented significant investment. It marked Ishbi-Benob as a warrior of means, someone who could afford the best equipment, or someone whose community valued him enough to provide it. The text says Ishbi-Benob thought to strike down David. The verb amar typically means to say, but here indicates intention or planning. This was not opportunistic violence. Ishbi-Benob recognized David, understood who he was, and decided to act. Perhaps he knew David had defeated Goliath decades earlier. Perhaps family stories had shaped his understanding of the Israelite king. Perhaps he saw this as vengeance, a chance to balance accounts for his kinsman's death. The moment hung in balance. An exhausted David, separated from his main force, or at least from immediate protection, faced a well-armed giant warrior wielding a new sword and heavy spear. The psychological situation inverted the Elah Valley encounter. There, young David advanced confidently toward an intimidating but overconfident Goliath. Here, aging David struggled to defend himself against a calculating enemy who had chosen his moment carefully. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, intervened. Abishai was David's nephew, his sister Zeruiah's son. 2 Samuel chapter 2 identifies Zeruiah as having 3 sons, Abishai, Joab, and Asahel. All 3 became prominent warriors in David's army. Joab eventually became commander of all military forces. Asahel died young, struck down by Abner during the civil war with Saul's house. Abishai emerged as one of David's most reliable warriors. This was not Abishai's first significant action. He had accompanied David into Saul's camp when the king slept, advocating for taking Saul's life. David refused, but took Saul's spear and water jug to prove their presence. Later, Abishai helped David defeat the Edomites. 2 Samuel chapter 23 lists him among the three mighty men, crediting him with raising his spear against 300 men. Abishai came to his aid and struck down the Philistine. The verb nakah indicates a lethal blow. The text does not detail the mechanics of combat. We don't know if Abishai surprised Ishbi-Benob, dueled him directly, or coordinated with others. What matters is the outcome. The giant warrior who nearly ended David's life fell instead. The immediate response from David's men reveals the broader significance. Then David's men swore to him, "You shall no longer go out with us to battle, lest you quench the lamp of Israel." This oath represented a turning point. The men who fought beside David recognized that his personal combat days had ended. Age and accumulated wounds had diminished his effectiveness. More importantly, his symbolic value to the nation exceeded his tactical contribution to battles. The metaphor of the lamp carried deep meaning. In ancient Near Eastern culture, lamps represented life, continuity, legacy. 1 Kings 11 mentions God maintaining a lamp for David in Jerusalem. 1 Kings 15 refers to a lamp given to David. The image suggested perpetual presence, ongoing dynasty, the light that guides through darkness. David's men understood that extinguishing this lamp would damage more than one life. It would threaten national stability and divine purpose. This incident fundamentally altered David's role. From this point forward, he directed battles but did not personally engage in frontline combat. His mighty men took on the responsibility of facing elite enemy warriors. David's legacy shifted from personal valor to leadership that empowered others. The man who had defined himself through individual achievement learned to define himself through collective success. Ishbi-Benob's defeat also sent a message to the other giants of Gath. Goliath's death might have seemed like a fluke, a lucky stone throw by an unusual opponent. But now another warrior from their lineage had fallen, this time to one of David's trained men. The pattern was establishing itself. The giant bloodline was not invincible. The warrior culture of Gath could be overcome. The new sword Ishbi-Benob carried became worthless. His careful planning came to nothing. His moment of opportunity, when David stood exhausted and vulnerable, slipped away. All his advantages in size, equipment, and positioning could not overcome the intervention of a skilled warrior arriving at the critical moment. The same divine protection that guided David's stone against Goliath guided Abishai's weapon against Ishbi-Benob. This encounter also reveals something about Philistine strategy. They continued fielding champions from the giant lineage even after Goliath's defeat. They had not abandoned this approach to warfare. Perhaps they believed Goliath's death was an anomaly. Perhaps they trusted in the proven track record of these warriors. Perhaps they had no better options for intimidating the Israelite forces. Whatever their reasoning, the strategy was failing. One by one, the giants of Gath were falling. Each defeat weakened the psychological advantage this warrior class had wielded for generations. The reputation built over centuries was crumbling. The last of the Anakim were proving mortal after all. For David personally, the Ishbi-Benob incident must have been sobering. The giant slayer had nearly become the giant's victim. The hero of Elah had needed rescuing. This humbling experience might have reinforced earlier lessons from his life, that victory comes through dependence on God and community rather than individual prowess. The young David trusted God while facing Goliath. The older David needed to trust God while others faced giants on his behalf. The name Ishbi-Benob would be forgotten by most readers. He merited only one verse in Scripture, yet his role in the story was crucial. He represented the first of Goliath's brothers to challenge David's forces after the famous Valley of Elah encounter. He came close to success. His defeat set the pattern for how the remaining brothers would fall, not to David personally, but to warriors David had trained and inspired. Saph. Saph the Gob, the second brother, receives the briefest treatment in the biblical record. 2 Samuel chapter 21 verse 18 allocates him a single sentence. After this there was again war with the Philistines at Gob. Then Sibbecai the Hushathite struck down Saph, who was one of the descendants of the giants. Saph's name appears in two forms across biblical texts. 2 Samuel calls him Saph. The parallel account in 1 Chronicles 20 verse 4 names him Sippai. These variants likely represent dialectical differences or scribal traditions rather than describing different individuals. Ancient Hebrew manuscripts sometimes showed such variations, especially for less prominent figures. The etymology of the name remains uncertain. Some scholars connect it to a root meaning threshold or basin. Others suggest possible Philistine origins, given the warrior's affiliation with Gath. The name's meaning matters less than its preservation. Someone considered it important to record this warrior's individual identity rather than leaving him as an anonymous giant casualty. The battle occurred at Gob. This location appears twice in 2 Samuel 21, once for Saph's defeat and once for the encounter with Lami. The exact site remains unidentified. No archaeological tells have been conclusively matched to biblical Gob. Some ancient manuscripts, including chronicles, give the location as Gezer instead. This variation has sparked scholarly debate about which reading is original. Gezer was a major Canaanite city controlling important routes between the coastal plain and the hill country. Archaeological excavations at Tel Gezer have revealed massive fortifications and evidence of Philistine presence. Joshua chapter 10 mentions Gezer's king coming to aid Lachish against the Israelites. Joshua 16 notes that the Israelites did not drive out the Canaanites from Gezer, who continued dwelling among the tribe of Ephraim. If the battle occurred at Gezer rather than Gob, this placement suggests the conflict happened in disputed borderland. Gezer sat at the edge of Philistine influence in territory both sides claimed. Battles in such locations often resulted from raids, territorial disputes, or attempts to control trade routes. The presence of a giant warrior from Gath indicates the Philistines considered this engagement significant enough to deploy elite forces. Alternatively, if Gob represents a separate location, perhaps a smaller settlement or battlefield site nearby, the name might have been familiar to the original audience but lost to later generations. Place names often survive only as long as the locations remain inhabited or strategically important. Abandoned sites disappear from collective memory, leaving only textual references that later readers cannot place. Sibbecai the Hushathite received credit for the victory. His identification as the Hushathite connects him to Hushah, a town in the tribal territory of Judah. First Chronicles mentions Hushah as a descendant of Judah through Caleb's lineage. This geographical and tribal connection placed Sibbecai firmly within David's support base in the Judean hill country. Sibbecai appears elsewhere in Chronicles as one of David's mighty men. 1 Chronicles 11 lists him among the 30 chief warriors. First Chronicles 27 identifies him as commander of the 8th Division, consisting of 24,000 men, serving during the 8th month. His leadership of such a large force indicates considerable military skill and organizational ability. 2 Samuel 23, in its list of David's 30 mighty men, does not mention Sibbecai by name. This has led some scholars to suggest he may be identified with one of the other names in that list, perhaps representing an alternate designation or title. Ancient warriors often bore multiple names or epithets reflecting their deeds or origins. The verb used for Saph's defeat is nakah, the same term used for Ishbi-Benob and other giants. It indicates a lethal blow, a strike that ended life. The text provides no detail about the combat itself. We don't know what weapons Sibbecai used. We don't learn about Saph's armor or fighting style. We don't discover whether this was a duel, an ambush, or combat in the midst of a larger battle. This brevity might reflect the chronicler's priorities. By the time this account was compiled, the specific details of individual combats mattered less than the overall pattern. The important information was that another giant from Gath had fallen to one of David's warriors. The cumulative effect of these victories interested the author more than the mechanics of each encounter. The phrase descended from the giants appears again, maintaining the consistent identification formula. Yeled HaRapha connects Saph directly to the same lineage as Goliath and Ishbi-Benob. He was not a random tall warrior. He belonged to the specific family line that stretched back through the Anakim to the ancient Rephaim populations of Canaan. Saph's defeat continued the pattern established with Ishbi-Benob. David's warriors, not David himself, were handling the giant threats. The king's near-death experience had prompted this strategic shift. Rather than risking the lamp of Israel in personal combat, The military was deploying proven warriors who could face elite enemies. This approach distributed both risk and glory across the army's leadership. The timing marker after this suggests sequential battles rather than a single campaign. The Philistine conflicts spanned years, even decades. Each encounter with a giant from Gath represented a separate incident in the ongoing struggle for territorial control. The giants were not grouped together in one location, but appeared across different battles in different contexts. This scattered pattern indicates the giant warriors served as elite troops deployed where needed, rather than forming a single unit. They might have led different Philistine contingents or responded to threats in various locations. Their strategic value lay partly in mobility, in the ability to reinforce threatened positions or spearhead assaults on Israelite territories. Saph's presence at Gob or Gezer also suggests the giants actively participated in Philistine military operations. They were not ceremonial figures or parade ground champions. They engaged in real combat, took real risks, and faced real opposition. Their defeats thus represented actual battlefield losses for the Philistine military machine, not just symbolic victories for the Israelites. The lack of detail about Saph's weaponry contrasts with the careful descriptions given for Goliath, Ishbi-Benob, and Lami. Perhaps Saph carried standard equipment. Perhaps the chronicler assumed readers would infer similarity to other family members. Perhaps the original source material provided less information about this particular warrior. Whatever the reason, Saph remains the most anonymous of the named brothers, yet his anonymity. Not every giant needed extensive introduction. Not every encounter required dramatic buildup. The very matter-of-fact reporting emphasizes how David's forces had adapted to facing such enemies. What once seemed impossible had become routine. The terror the Anakim inspired in Moses' generation, the fear Goliath provoked in Saul's army, had given way to professional military competence. Sibbechai's victory over Saph demonstrated that defeating giants did not require divine intervention through miraculous circumstances. It required skilled, experienced warriors executing their duties effectively. The faith that empowered David at Elah now manifested through trained soldiers doing their jobs. The same God who guided a shepherd's stone guided a warrior's weapon. For the people of the Judean hill country, particularly those from Hushah and surrounding areas, Sibbechai's achievement would have carried special significance. He was one of their own, a local man who rose to command thousands and personally defeated one of the feared giants of Gath. His success validated the military system David had built and proved that ordinary men from ordinary towns could face extraordinary challenges successfully. Saph's death reduced the giant population in Gath by one more. The roster of warriors from this legendary bloodline grew shorter. Each loss made the next battle harder for the Philistines, as their supply of elite champions dwindled. Each victory made the next battle easier for the Israelites, as confidence replaced fear. The shift in military psychology was as important as the tactical outcomes. The brother at Gath, the unnamed giant with 12 fingers and toes. Some warriors are remembered for their victories, others for their weapons. This particular giant is remembered for his anatomy. 2 Samuel chapter 21, verses 20 and 21 introduce him with unusual detail. And there was again war at Gath, where there was a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number, and he also was descended from the giants. The text carefully counts his digits. 6 fingers per hand equals 12 fingers total. 6 toes per foot equals 12 toes total. Combined, 24 digits instead of the typical 20. This condition, known medically as polydactyly, occurs naturally in human populations. Modern studies estimate prevalence at approximately 1 in 700 to 1,000 live births. Polydactyly can manifest in different forms. Some cases involve fully functional extra digits with complete bone structure, joints, and muscle control. Other cases present partially formed digits, sometimes merely skin tags or small protrusions. The biblical text does not specify which type this warrior possessed. The fact that his extra digits merited mention suggests they were substantial enough to be visually distinctive. The condition often runs in families, inherited through autosomal dominant genes. If one parent carries the trait, each child has roughly a 50% chance of inheriting it. This genetic pattern explains why polydactyly might concentrate in a specific bloodline. If the giant populations of Gath practiced endogamy, marrying within their own group to preserve their distinctive characteristics, such traits could become more prevalent. Ancient cultures viewed physical abnormalities through various interpretive lenses. Some saw them as divine signs, others considered them marks of special destiny or power. Still others viewed them as curses or ill omens. The biblical text presents this giant's extra digits matter-of-factly, as identifying information rather than moral commentary. The digits made him recognizable, marked him as belonging to a specific lineage. The phrase man of great stature translates the Hebrew ish midah, literally man of measure or man of size. This indicates notable height without specifying exact measurements. The text emphasizes physical presence rather than numerical precision. Combined with the distinctive digits, the description paints a picture of an imposing figure who stood out even among other warriors. The battle occurred at Gath itself, the home base of these giant warriors. Previous encounters happened at various locations across the borderlands. This one brought the conflict to the giant stronghold. Whether the Israelites attacked Gath or the battle occurred in nearby territory claimed by that city remains unclear. What matters is the geographical connection. This warrior fought on or near his home ground. Verse 21 adds behavioral detail. And when he taunted Israel, Jonathan the son of Shimei, David's brother, struck him down. The verb karaf appears again, the same root used for Goliath's defiance in 1 Samuel 17. This giant followed family tradition, hurling insults and challenges at the Israelite forces. The cultural practice of pre-battle verbal combat, common across ancient Near Eastern warfare, continued in the next generation. Taunting served multiple purposes in ancient combat. It demonstrated courage and confidence. It demoralized opponents. It established social hierarchy and honor claims. It sometimes provoked enemies into rash decisions. A skilled taunter could shift psychological advantage before weapons ever clashed. This giant apparently learned these techniques, perhaps from Goliath himself, if they overlapped chronologically, or from family teaching that preserved such methods. Jonathan receives identification as son of Shimei, David's brother. This genealogical detail has caused some confusion. In other passages, David's brother is called Shemiah or Shemiah. The name variations likely represent dialectical or scribal differences. What remains consistent is the familial connection. Jonathan was David's nephew, part of the extended family network that formed the core of David's military leadership. This Jonathan should not be confused with Jonathan, son of Saul, David's famous friend from earlier in the narrative. That Jonathan had fallen at Mount Gilboa decades before these giant encounters. This later Jonathan, David's nephew, belonged to a different generation. His role in defeating the final named giant parallels other family members' contributions to eliminating this threat. The text does not detail the combat mechanics. We don't learn what weapons Jonathan used or how the fight unfolded. We don't discover whether this was formal single combat, an opportunistic strike, or confrontation within a larger battle. The chronicler considered the outcome sufficient. Another giant from the bloodline fell. Another of David's family members proved capable of facing such enemies. The giant's extra digits raise interesting questions about combat effectiveness. Did they provide any advantage? 12 fingers might offer enhanced grip strength on weapons or shields. 12 toes might improve balance and footwork. Conversely, the extra digits might have caused difficulties with standard equipment designed for typical human anatomy. Gloves, if worn, would need custom fitting. Footwear would require adaptation. Ancient armor and weapons were often custom-made for elite warriors anyway. A fighter of this giant's stature and status would have had equipment tailored to his physique. The extra digits would simply represent one more specification for the artisan crafting his gear. In this sense, his unusual anatomy might not have affected his combat capability significantly, though it certainly made him memorable. The preservation of this anatomical detail in the biblical record suggests eyewitness testimony. Someone observed this warrior closely enough to count his digits. Someone considered the information worth recording. Someone ensured it passed into the written sources that eventually became scripture. The specificity argues against legendary embellishment and toward historical documentation. Medical historians note that polydactyly appears in skeletal remains from various ancient populations. While not common, it was not vanishingly rare either. The condition is compatible with normal life expectancy and physical activity. There is no reason to doubt that a warrior could possess extra digits and still function as an effective combatant. The biblical account aligns with biological possibility. For the original audience, this giant's distinctive feature might have served practical purpose. In a world without photographs or detailed written descriptions, identifying individual warriors in battle or in accounts of battle presented challenges. Physical markers like unusual height, specific weapons, or anatomical distinctiveness help differentiate one fighter from another in oral tradition and written records. The unnamed status of this giant is curious. Unlike his brothers Ishbi-Benob, Saf, and Lami, he receives no personal name in the surviving text. Perhaps his name was lost in transmission. Perhaps the extra digits were considered sufficient identification. Perhaps his name never held the same significance as his distinctive physical trait. In collective memory, he became the one with 12 fingers and 12 toes rather than someone specifically named brother or son. His defeat by Jonathan completed the pattern of David's extended family systematically eliminating the giant threat. David himself defeated Goliath. David's nephew Abishai rescued David from Ishbi-Benob. David's warriors Sibbecai and Elhanan defeated Saf and Lami. Now David's nephew Jonathan defeated the final brother. The campaign had truly become a family affair, with multiple generations of David's lineage participating in removing this ancient enemy. The location at Gath for this final encounter carries symbolic weight. The city that bred these warriors, that gave them refuge after Joshua's conquest, that merged Anakim heritage with Philistine military culture, finally saw its champion lineage ended on its own territory. The giant stronghold could no longer produce warriors capable of intimidating the Israelite forces. The legendary bloodline reached its terminus. Lami, the brother of Goliath. Among all the giants who fell to David's warriors, only one receives explicit identification as Goliath's brother. 1 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 5 states clearly, "And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan the son of Jair struck down Lami the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." The name Lami appears only in this verse throughout Scripture. Its etymology likely connects to lechem, the Hebrew word for bread. Whether this represents his actual name, or perhaps a nickname, remains uncertain. The linguistic connection to Bethlehem, house of bread, is striking but maybe coincidental. What matters is that Chronicles preserves his identity as specifically and undeniably Goliath's brother. His weapon receives the same description as Goliath's, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. This phrase appears 3 times in the biblical accounts of giants from Gath. 1 Samuel 17 uses it for Goliath. Chronicles uses it for Lami. The parallel passage in 2 Samuel 21, despite its textual corruption regarding Lami's identity, also includes this distinctive description. The weaver's beam comparison refers to the wooden rod used in ancient looms. These beams needed to be straight, strong, and substantial to support the tension of warp threads during weaving. They were typically made from dense hardwood, hewn to appropriate thickness. The comparison suggests spear shafts of unusual diameter and weight, capable of supporting large iron points without bending or breaking. That both Goliath and Lami carried such distinctive weapons suggests family tradition or training. Perhaps their father or other relatives taught them a specific fighting style that emphasized heavy spears. Perhaps Gath's warriors specialized in this weapon type, developing techniques to maximize its advantages. Perhaps the family maintained access to craftsmen skilled in producing such equipment. Whatever the origin, the weaver's beam spears became a signature of this bloodline. Elhanan, son of Jair, receives credit for defeating Lami. His name means God is gracious, a common Hebrew formation combining El, God, with Kanan, to be gracious. His father's name, Jair, connects to a root meaning he enlightens or he shines. These names place Elhanan firmly within Israelite culture and covenant identity. The parallel passage in 2 Samuel 21 verse 19 creates textual complexity. That verse reads, "And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan the son of Jare-Oregim the Bethlehemite struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." This appears to credit Elhanan with defeating Goliath himself, directly contradicting 1 Samuel 17, where David achieved that victory. This contradiction has puzzled readers for millennia. Ancient Jewish commentators proposed various solutions. Some suggested Elhanan was another name for David, though this lacks supporting evidence. Others proposed that multiple giants bore the name Goliath, which seems unlikely. Medieval scholars sometimes argued for scribal error, which turned out to be correct. The Chronicles passage resolves the problem by inserting two crucial words, Lami and brother. Textual scholars have analyzed how the Samuel verse became corrupted. The Hebrew text of 2 Samuel contains what appears to be a scribal duplication. The word origim in Jare-Oregim matches the word origim, weavers, in the phrase about the spear. A scribe's eye apparently jumped from one occurrence to another, causing text to be omitted. Additionally, the Hebrew letters in Lami are similar to those in Bethlehemite. In ancient Hebrew script, which originally lacked vowel points and used some ambiguous letter forms, confusion between similar-looking words could occur during copying. A scribe might misread Lami brother of as part of Bethlehemite, especially if the text was damaged or unclear in his source manuscript. Chronicles, compiled later and drawing from multiple sources, preserved the correct reading. The chronicler had access to records that maintained the distinction between Goliath and his brother. When Chronicles was written, probably during or after the Babylonian exile, the authors were working to create an accurate historical record for the restored community. They compared sources and resolved contradictions when possible. This textual history demonstrates both the challenges of ancient manuscript transmission and the reliability of having parallel accounts. Scribal errors did occur. Text could be corrupted through copying mistakes, but when multiple versions existed, scholars could identify problems and reconstruct original readings. The preservation of both Samuel and Chronicles allows modern readers to understand what happened. The fact that Elhanan defeated Lami rather than Goliath also makes narrative sense. David's victory over Goliath launched his public career. It established his reputation. It fulfilled Samuel's anointing. It demonstrated divine favor. That victory belonged uniquely to David. The idea that someone else actually defeated Goliath would undermine the entire structure of David's rise to power. Lami's role as Goliath's actual brother adds emotional dimension. This was not simply another tall warrior from Gath. This was family. When Lami entered battle, he carried personal motivation beyond Philistine military objectives. His brother had fallen to an Israelite champion. Honor might demand vengeance. Family loyalty might compel action. The psychological stakes exceeded normal combat. Elhanan faced a warrior potentially driven by grief and anger. Lami was not simply following orders or seeking glory. He was confronting the nation that had taken his brother's life. This emotional element could make him more dangerous, more unpredictable, more determined. A warrior fighting for family honor often displays extra ferocity and disregard for personal safety. Yet Elhanan prevailed. The mighty man of David, whose name proclaimed God's grace, struck down the brother of the most famous giant in biblical history. This victory demonstrated that David's success at Elah was not unrepeatable fortune. It was the beginning of a pattern. The Israelite forces, empowered by faith and skill, could consistently defeat the giant warriors of Gath. The location of this battle receives less attention than other encounters. Chronicles does not specify where Lami fell. The corrupted Samuel text mentions Gob, but whether this applies to Lami's defeat remains uncertain given the textual problems. What matters more than geography is the fact of defeat. Another warrior from the giant bloodline was removed from the battlefield. Lami's death had particular symbolic weight because of his explicit connection to Goliath. As long as Goliath's actual brother survived and fought, the shadow of that first giant remained. The family line persisted. The potential for a new champion from that same stock existed. Lami's defeat closed that particular chapter more definitively than the other brothers' falls could. For the Philistines, losing Lami meant losing a warrior with direct claim to Goliath's legacy. This was not a distant relative or clan member. This was Goliath's brother, presumably trained alongside him, perhaps taught by the same mentors, certainly shaped by the same warrior culture. His combat style might have mirrored Goliath's. His tactics might have echoed his brother's approach. Defeating him proved the Israelites could handle even the closest approximation to the original giant threat. The fact that Elhanan accomplished this rather than David mirrors the earlier pattern. David had proved himself against the first and greatest giant. His warriors then proved themselves against the remaining family members. This distribution of victories built confidence throughout the Israelite military hierarchy. It was not about one champion, it was about a culture of faith and competence that could produce multiple giant slayers. Elhanan's background as a Bethlehemite, preserved even in the corrupted Samuel text, creates interesting symmetry. David came from Bethlehem. Elhanan came from Bethlehem. The town that produced the shepherd king also produced the warrior who defeated the giant king's brother. This geographical connection suggests Bethlehem cultivated a particular kind of courage or faith. The place where David grew up produced others capable of similar feats. The spear, like a weaver's beam, passed from active use. Lami's distinctive weapon, which had likely struck down many opponents, fell silent. The craftsmen who forged such implements lost a customer. The techniques for wielding these massive spears would soon have no practitioners. The martial tradition of the giant warriors of Gath was approaching its end, one fallen brother at a time. Solving a contradiction. Elhanan and the slaying of Goliath. For centuries, biblical scholars and careful readers have noticed a troubling contradiction in the text. 1 Samuel 17 clearly states that David struck down Goliath the Gittite. Yet 2 Samuel 21 verse 19 appears to credit this same victory to Elhanan, son of Jaare-Oregim. How can both accounts be true? The relevant passage from 2 Samuel reads, "And there was again war with the Philistines at Gob, and Elhanan, the son of Jaare-Oregim, the Bethlehemite, struck down Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." The syntax is straightforward. The grammar is clear. Elhanan killed Goliath. This seems to flatly contradict the famous story every reader knows. Ancient commentators proposed various solutions. Jewish tradition sometimes suggested Elhanan was another name for David. Kings and heroes in the ancient world often bore multiple names or titles. Perhaps David was called Elhanan in certain contexts. This theory, while creative, lacks supporting evidence from any other biblical text. David never receives identification as Elhanan elsewhere. Another proposal held that there were two giants named Goliath. Perhaps Goliath was a title or designation rather than a personal name. Perhaps Gath produced multiple warriors who bore this name across different generations. This theory faces the problem that the biblical text treats Goliath as a specific individual, not a title. The detailed description of his armor and weapons in 1 Samuel suggests a particular person, not a generic designation. Some commentators took a more skeptical approach, suggesting the texts reflected competing traditions about who actually defeated the famous giant. In this view, different communities or sources preserved different heroes for the same deed. Later editors assembled these competing accounts without fully reconciling them. This approach, while accounting for the contradiction, raises broader questions about biblical reliability. The actual solution comes from careful comparison with 1 Chronicles. Chronicles 20 verse 5 provides a parallel account with crucial differences. "And there was again war with the Philistines, and Elhanan the son of Jair struck down Lami the brother of Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam." Here, Elhanan defeats not Goliath himself, but Lami, explicitly identified as Goliath's brother. This Chronicles reading resolves the contradiction immediately. Elhanan did strike down a giant from Gath, whose spear was like a weaver's beam, but that giant was Goliath's brother Lami, not Goliath himself. The 2 Samuel text suffered corruption in transmission, losing the words that identified the victim as Lami and specifying his relationship to Goliath. How did this corruption occur? Hebrew manuscripts were copied by hand for centuries before the invention of printing. Scribes occasionally made errors. Letters could be misread, especially in damaged or unclear source texts. Words could be accidentally omitted when a scribe's eye jumped from one similar phrase to another. Given the repetitive nature of the giant descriptions, such errors became more likely. Textual analysis reveals the mechanics. The Hebrew word for Bethlehemite shares several letters with Lami. In ancient Hebrew script, which originally used only consonants without vowel points, the similarity would be more pronounced. A scribe working from a damaged text might misread Lami, brother of, as part of the word meaning Bethlehemite. Additionally, the name Jare Origam Jim in Samuel appears suspicious. Origam is the Hebrew word for weavers, plural form. This same word appears later in the verse in the phrase, weaver's beam. A scribe's eye might have caught this word from later in the sentence and accidentally incorporated it into the name Yara. The Chronicles reading gives simply Jair without the extra element. These mechanical explanations for scribal error are well documented in textual criticism. Ancient manuscripts show various types of copying mistakes. The presence of similar words in close proximity, technical terms that appear multiple times, and damaged source texts all contribute to the possibility of error. The 2 Samuel passage shows signs of exactly these problems. Chronicles, compiled later and drawing from multiple sources, had opportunity to compare different manuscript traditions. The chronicler or chroniclers worked to create an accurate historical record. When they found contradictions between sources, they attempted to resolve them. In this case, they preserved the reading that maintained consistency with the broader narrative while still recording Elhanan's significant victory. The timing of Chronicles' composition supports this explanation. Most scholars date Chronicles to the post-exilic period, after the return from Babylonian captivity. The authors were working perhaps 4 to 5 centuries after David's reign. They had access to royal archives, temple records, and multiple manuscript traditions that had survived the destruction of Jerusalem. Their project involved synthesizing these sources into coherent history. The books of Samuel, by contrast, reached their final form earlier, possibly during the divided monarchy period. The textual tradition had less time to identify and correct errors. When copies of Samuel were made, scribal mistakes might have been perpetuated if the error existed in an early authoritative manuscript. Once an error entered the mainstream textual tradition, it could persist for generations. Modern textual criticism has developed methods for identifying such problems. When parallel passages exist, scholars compare them. They examine ancient translations like the Septuagint to see what Hebrew texts those translators were working from. They analyze manuscript families to trace the history of textual variants. They apply linguistic knowledge to identify anomalies that suggest corruption. In this case, the evidence overwhelmingly supports the Chronicles reading. Lami was the brother of Goliath. Elhanan defeated Lami. The Samuel text suffered corruption that changed Lami, brother of Goliath, into Goliath. This corruption created an apparent contradiction with 1 Samuel 17. But the original text, preserved in Chronicles, contained no such contradiction. This resolution matters for several reasons. First, it maintains the integrity of the David and Goliath story. David's victory at Elah remains unchallenged. His role as the giant slayer who launched a military and political career stands secure. The theological significance of young David facing the Philistine champion with faith alone is preserved. Second, it demonstrates the value of having multiple biblical accounts. When Samuel and Chronicles parallel each other, the existence of both allows for comparison and correction. Apparent contradictions can be resolved by careful examination. The biblical text becomes more trustworthy when we understand transmission history and can identify where problems occurred. Third, it validates Elhanan's own achievement. He defeated a significant enemy, a warrior from the same family as Goliath, a man who carried the same distinctive weapon. Lami was not simply any Philistine soldier. He was Goliath's brother, trained in the same traditions, part of the same feared bloodline. Elhanan's victory deserves recognition without falsely crediting him with David's accomplishment. Fourth, it shows the importance of preserving exact details. The fact that Lami is specifically called Goliath's brother matters. It establishes the family connection. It explains why this particular giant merited special attention in the biblical record. It helps readers understand the systematic nature of David's campaign against this warrior dynasty. The scribal error in Samuel, while significant, does not undermine the overall reliability of the biblical text. Ancient manuscripts were copied by humans, and humans make mistakes. What matters is that the broader manuscript tradition, including parallel accounts and different textual witnesses, allows these errors to be identified and corrected. The Bible preserves its own checking mechanism through its multiple books and sources. For modern readers, this example serves as a reminder to read carefully and compare parallel passages. When apparent contradictions appear, investigating further often reveals resolution. The books of Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles frequently cover the same events from different perspectives or with different details. These variations usually complement rather than contradict each other when properly understood. The Lami story also reminds us that biblical history focuses on theological significance rather than exhaustive detail. The chroniclers recorded what mattered for understanding God's work through David's reign. The defeat of the giant brothers mattered because it demonstrated divine faithfulness and the completion of the conquest mandate. Whether every detail of every battle was preserved mattered less than capturing the overall pattern and significance. Elhanan emerges from this textual confusion as a real historical figure who performed a real and significant deed. He struck down Lami, brother of Goliath, continuing the systematic elimination of the giant bloodline. His name deserves to be remembered alongside Sibbecai, Abishai, and Jonathan as one of David's warriors who faced the descendants of the Anakim and prevailed. The last of the giants, the end of an era in Canaan. The elimination of Goliath's brothers marked more than military victories. It represented the conclusion of a conflict that began when Israelite spies first glimpsed the Anakim in the hill country of Canaan. For centuries, these populations had represented obstacles to divine promise. Their removal signaled fundamental change in the land. Joshua chapter 14 through 15 chronicles the beginning of this end. Caleb, then 85 years old, asked Joshua for the hill country where the Anakim lived. He had spied out that territory 45 years earlier. Unlike his generation, he had not feared these giants. Now, in his old age, he requested the privilege of driving them out. Joshua blessed him and assigned Hebron as his inheritance. Caleb fulfilled his request. He drove out the three sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. These were the specific names the spies had reported in Numbers 13. For 4.5 decades, these particular individuals or their descendants had occupied Hebron. Caleb's victory was personal, finishing what he had wanted to do since his youth. Yet Caleb's achievement, while significant, was not complete. Joshua 11 verse 22 notes that while Joshua destroyed most Anakim populations in the hill country, some remained in 3 Philistine cities, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. These survivors found refuge in territories that would soon host the sea peoples migrating from the Mediterranean. The Philistine occupation created safe havens where the Anakim could persist. This geographical detail explains why the giant problem resurged during Saul and David's time. The Anakim populations in Philistine cities had several generations to regroup, intermarry, and integrate into their host society. They brought their physical stature and warrior traditions into Philistine military structures. The fusion created the elite champion class that included Goliath and his brothers. The strategic implications were serious. The Philistines already possessed superior ironworking technology. They controlled key coastal routes and fertile agricultural plains. Adding giants to their military roster multiplied their advantages. These warriors could serve as shock troops, breaking enemy formations. They could function as champions in single combat, as Goliath attempted. They could provide psychological intimidation that demoralized opponents before battle began. David's campaign against these warriors therefore addressed both immediate and historical challenges. Immediately, he was removing threats to his kingdom's security. Historically, he was completing the conquest mandate that Joshua began and that Caleb advanced. The promised land was supposed to be cleared of its original inhabitants. The surviving Anakim in Philistine territory represented unfinished business from the initial settlement. The systematic nature of the giant eliminations suggests deliberate strategy. 5 warriors from the Gath bloodline fell during David's reign. The timing spanned years, indicating multiple campaigns rather than a single operation. David approached this as a project, not just a series of battles. He was systematically removing a category of threat rather than responding reactively to individual challenges. This strategic approach required patience. Giants did not conveniently gather in one location for elimination. They appeared in different contexts at different times in different battles. David needed to maintain focus across years while dealing with numerous other threats to his kingdom. The Philistines were not his only enemies. Moabites, Ammonites, Arameans, and Edomites all required military attention. Yet David ensured that whenever giant warriors appeared, his forces were ready. The empowerment of his warriors was crucial. David could not personally face every giant. His near-death experience with Ishbi-Benob proved that. Instead, he developed a military culture where elite warriors could handle such enemies. Abishai, Sibbecai, Elhanan, and Jonathan all proved capable of defeating giant opponents. This distribution of capability meant the mission did not depend on David's personal combat effectiveness. The theological dimension cannot be overlooked. The Anakim had been the test that the Exodus generation failed. Their presence inspired such fear that the entire congregation lost faith in God's promise. Numbers 14 records divine judgment. Because they refused to enter the land after seeing the giants, that generation would die in the wilderness. Only Joshua and Caleb, who maintained faith, would survive to enter. The giants thus represented a specific type of spiritual challenge. Would God's people trust him in the face of intimidating obstacles? Would they believe his promises despite apparent impossibilities? The first generation answered no. Joshua's generation answered yes, but only partially, leaving pockets of giants in Philistine cities. David's generation finally answered with complete commitment, eliminating every identified giant warrior. This progression shows how divine purposes work across time. The promise was given to Abraham. The conquest began under Joshua. The completion waited for David. Each generation advanced the work to the extent their faith and capability allowed. David benefited from the groundwork laid by his predecessors. They faced harder circumstances with less preparation. He faced the remnant with a trained army and proven tactics. The end of the giant bloodline also meant the end of a particular type of warfare. Champion combat, where individual warriors determined battles through single combat, became less viable. The Philistines could no longer field intimidating giants who might win wars without full army engagement. Future conflicts would depend more on tactics, equipment, and organized military movements rather than on individual warrior prowess. Archaeological evidence from this period shows changes in warfare patterns across the region. Fortification styles evolved. Weapon types diversified. Military organization became more sophisticated. The era when individual champions could determine outcomes was giving way to more systematic approaches to conflict. The giant warriors represented the old model. David's military represented the emerging paradigm. For the populations of Canaan, these developments meant security improved. Random raids by champion warriors diminished. The terror associated with facing giants faded. Communities could focus more on agriculture, trade, and normal life rather than living under constant military threat. The removal of these warriors created space for economic and social development. The timing aligned with David's consolidation of his kingdom. As he secured his borders, defeated surrounding enemies, and established administrative systems, the elimination of internal threats like the giant warriors complemented his broader state-building project. A stable kingdom required removing destabilizing elements. The giants qualified as exactly such elements. The three Philistine cities mentioned in Joshua 11, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, all had different fates. Gath, the giant stronghold, was eventually destroyed. Archaeological excavations at Tel Asafi showed destruction layers from the 9th century BCE. By the time of the prophets, Gath had diminished in importance. Gaza and Ashdod continued as significant cities, but without their giant populations, they posed different types of threats. The biblical narrative shows awareness of this transition. Earlier texts describe the giants as widespread and numerous. Later texts describe them as remnants and survivors. Finally, accounts from David's reign describe them as individuals who can be named and counted. The population had shrunk from a broad demographic presence to a specialized military elite, to isolated warriors, to nothing. The pattern shows systematic reduction across generations. 2 Samuel 21, verse 22, provides the summary. These four were descended from the giants in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Four specific encounters are documented in that chapter, beyond the original Goliath battle. The number suggests comprehensiveness. These were not random samples, but the complete roster of remaining giant warriors from that bloodline. The phrase fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants distributes credit appropriately. David initiated the campaign by defeating Goliath. His example and leadership inspired and equipped others to continue the work. The victories belonged to him strategically, even when his warriors accomplished them tactically. This is proper military attribution, recognizing both command and execution. The impact on Israelite confidence cannot be overstated. The people who once compared themselves to grasshoppers before the giants now employed warriors who routinely defeated such enemies. The psychological shift transformed national identity. Fear gave way to faith-based courage. Paralysis gave way to effective action. The change validated the belief that God fought for his people when they trusted him. This confidence enabled subsequent military successes. David's campaigns against surrounding nations benefited from an army that had faced and defeated the most intimidating enemies imaginable. If his warriors could handle giants, they could handle anyone. The battles against Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Aram all proceeded from this foundation of proven capability. The completion of the giant elimination also freed prophetic imagination. Later biblical texts could refer back to this achievement as demonstration of divine faithfulness. When prophets wanted to encourage faith in the face of overwhelming odds, they pointed to David's victories. When teachers wanted to illustrate the power of trusting God, they referenced the shepherd boy who faced the giant. The story became parable and inspiration for future generations, yet the memory of the giants persisted in Israelite consciousness. They remained in legend and teaching even after disappearing from reality. The fear they once inspired served as benchmark for describing other threats. Prophets compared enemy armies to giants. Psalmists referenced them in prayers for deliverance. The giants became symbolic of any overwhelming challenge that requires divine intervention to overcome. This symbolic use shows how thoroughly they had been defeated. They could serve as metaphors precisely because they no longer posed actual threat. The transformation from present danger to past example marked complete victory. David and his warriors had not just defeated individual enemies, they had eliminated an entire category of threat that had menaced the region for centuries. The land finally rested from the giant presence. The cities they had occupied returned to normal habitation. The trade routes they had threatened opened to commerce. The fear they inspired dissolved into history. Canaan entered a new era, one where the ancient inhabitants who had resisted the Israelite settlement were finally completely removed from power. Giants in myth and memory, the legacy of the Gittite bloodline. The story of Goliath transcended its historical moment to become one of humanity's most enduring narratives. His name entered common language as shorthand for any overwhelming obstacle. David and Goliath became proverbial for unlikely victory against impossible odds. Yet while Goliath achieved immortality in cultural memory, his brothers faded into obscurity. Understanding this divergence reveals how stories are shaped and preserved. The power of the David and Goliath narrative comes from its archetypal structure: young versus old, small versus large, faith versus pride, unexpected versus established. These contrasts create memorable drama. The shepherd boy with a sling confronting the armored giant creates visual imagery that transcends culture and language. Artists across centuries have depicted the scene. Writers have retold it. Teachers have used it to illustrate principles about courage and faith. The brothers' stories lack these dramatic elements. They were defeated by trained warriors, not shepherd boys. They fell in routine military encounters rather than formal single combat before massed armies. Their defeats were tactically significant, but lacked the theological and narrative weight of David's victory at Elah. No prophet anointed Sibbecai beforehand. No army watched Elhanan approach with only a sling. The circumstances were different. Jewish tradition preserved some additional details about the giants of Gath. The Talmud, compiled centuries after the biblical events, includes discussions about the Anakim and their descendants. Some rabbinic sources expanded on their origins, connecting them to the Nephilim of Genesis 6. Others focused on their moral character, portraying them as arrogant and opposed to divine purposes. These interpretations show how later generations processed the biblical accounts. The Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of Hebrew scriptures completed around 250 BCE, made choices in translating giant-related terms. It rendered Nephilim as gigantes, giving us the English word giants. It standardized measurements that varied in Hebrew manuscripts. These translation decisions influenced how Greek-speaking Jewish communities and later Christian readers understood the biblical giants. Early Christian interpreters saw typological significance in David's victory. David became a type of Christ, defeating Satan, represented by Goliath. The stone from the brook represented the stone rejected by builders that became the cornerstone. The 5 smooth stones represented the 5 books of Torah. These allegorical readings, while not reflecting original authorial intent, show how influential the story became in Christian theological imagination. Medieval Jewish commentators like Rashi and Ibn Ezra discussed the textual problems in Samuel regarding Elhanan. They noticed the contradiction with Chronicles and proposed various solutions. Their work preserved scholarly awareness of these issues long before modern textual criticism developed its methods. The giant stories became test cases for how to handle apparent scriptural discrepancies. Apocryphal and pseudepigraphal texts elaborated on giant lore. The Book of Enoch, not included in most biblical canons, expanded the Genesis 6 Nephilim account into extensive mythology about fallen angels and their giant offspring. These traditions influenced Jewish apocalyptic literature and some early Christian writings. While not directly about Goliath's brothers, they show the broader cultural fascination with giants in biblical tradition. Renaissance artists favored the David and Goliath story. Michelangelo's famous statue depicts David before the battle, sling over shoulder, gaze focused on his opponent. Donatello created an earlier bronze David standing victoriously over Goliath's severed head. Caravaggio painted the aftermath, showing young David holding the giant's head. These masterworks ensured the story remained central to Western art for centuries. The brothers, meanwhile, received no such attention. No famous sculptures depict Sibbecai facing Saph. No paintings immortalize Elhanan's victory over Lami. No artistic tradition developed around Abishai rescuing David from Ishbi-Benob. The lack of visual representation contributed to their obscurity. Stories without images fade faster from collective memory, especially in eras when most people could not read. Literature across cultures retold the David and Goliath story. It appeared in children's books, moral tales, adventure stories, and psychological studies. Malcolm Gladwell's modern bestseller David and Goliath re-examined the story through the lens of advantage and disadvantage, arguing David actually had tactical superiority. Such reinterpretations keep the story alive for new generations and contexts. The brothers' stories, by contrast, appear mainly in scholarly works and detailed biblical commentaries. They interest historians and theologians more than general readers. This specialization limits their cultural penetration. Stories that remain academic rarely achieve the widespread recognition that popular narratives enjoy. Yet the brothers' obscurity does not diminish their significance. They represent the unglamorous work of completing a mission. David's victory at Elah was spectacular. The subsequent defeats of Goliath's brothers were necessary. Headline achievements need follow-through. Celebrity moments require systematic implementation. The brothers' defeats ensured that David's famous victory translated into lasting strategic benefit. This pattern appears throughout biblical narrative. Abraham received the promise. Isaac maintained it. Jacob struggled with it. Joseph preserved it through famine. Moses liberated the people. Joshua led them into the land. Judges defended them. Samuel transitioned them to monarchy. David consolidated the kingdom. Each generation built on previous work, often doing less celebrated but equally necessary tasks. The giant elimination campaign fits this pattern. Goliath's defeat opened possibilities. His brothers' defeats secured those possibilities. The 5 victories together accomplished what one victory alone could not. This is how divine purposes typically advance, through accumulated faithfulness across time, not through isolated moments of drama. Modern interpreters sometimes focus exclusively on the famous David and Goliath story, missing the broader context. They treat it as allegory about faith overcoming obstacles without recognizing the historical campaign it initiated. They extract spiritual principles without understanding the military and political realities. The brothers' stories provide grounding, showing how the initial victory led to sustained effort and complete success. The geographic concentration of these warriors in Gath deserves attention. Why did one city produce all five giants? The answer likely combines genetics, culture, and historical circumstance. Gath harbored Anakim survivors after Joshua's conquest. These populations maintained distinct identity even after Philistine occupation. Intermarriage within the group preserved physical characteristics. Military culture valued and cultivated warrior skills. Generations of selection created a specialized elite. This phenomenon has parallels in other ancient cultures. Sparta developed specialized warrior culture. Rome cultivated military excellence across generations. Various peoples produced warriors with distinctive characteristics and methods. Gath was not unique in creating elite soldiers, only in maintaining a bloodline connected to the pre-conquest inhabitants of Canaan. The symbolism of giants persists in modern consciousness. We speak of slaying giants to describe overcoming major challenges. We call dominant competitors giants in their industries. We use Goliath to represent any seemingly unbeatable opponent. This metaphorical usage shows the story's enduring power. It has become language, not just narrative. Yet the metaphorical usage often oversimplifies. The biblical giants were real warriors who required real military responses. They were not merely psychological barriers or internal fears. They were external threats with weapons and training. Reducing them to pure symbolism misses the historical reality that David's generation faced actual dangerous enemies who needed to be defeated through actual combat. The balance between literal and symbolic understanding enriches interpretation. Yes, giants represent overwhelming challenges that require faith to overcome. Yes, David's victory models trusting God in impossible circumstances. But also, giants were real. They had families, they participated in wars, they were systematically eliminated through sustained military campaign. Both levels matter. The Forgotten Brothers teach humility about fame. Ishbi-Benob nearly achieved what Goliath could not, ending David's life. Yet most readers do not know his name. Lami carried the same distinctive spear as his famous brother. Few remember him. The unnamed giant with 12 fingers and toes had the most unusual physical characteristic. He remains anonymous to most. Fame depends on context and narrative structure as much as on achievement. This reality applies beyond ancient warfare. History remembers those whose stories fit memorable patterns. It forgets those whose contributions, while significant, do not translate into compelling narrative. The brothers' obscurity does not reflect their irrelevance. It reflects how memory works, how stories are preserved, and what kinds of accounts capture imagination across generations. The ultimate legacy of the Gittite bloodline is its absence. They no longer exist. Their warrior culture ended. Their genetic line disappeared or merged into other populations. Their distinctive characteristics no longer appear. The giant problem that plagued the Israelites from the time of the spies through the time of Saul reached complete resolution. That absence is itself the achievement, the proof that the campaign succeeded. Contemporary readers encountering these stories must balance multiple perspectives. We read for historical understanding, seeking to grasp what actually happened in ancient Canaan. We read for theological meaning, discovering how God works through human action across time. We read for practical application, learning principles about faith, perseverance, and completing necessary tasks. All three approaches have value. Together, they honor both the text and the real people whose lives it records. The story of Goliath's brothers is the story of completion. It is the account of how dramatic victories require sustained follow-through. It is the testimony of warriors who faced intimidating enemies without prophetic anointing or massive audiences. It is the proof that God's purposes advance through accumulated faithfulness, not just isolated moments of glory. And it is the reminder that the most important work is often the least celebrated, but no less essential for achieving lasting change.